I want to take a deeper look at a game that I really like, but it seems like everybody else thinks it's the worst in the series. Dark Souls 2. Before we go any further, I've done multi-part videos in the past, but they don't always do well because people don't tend to follow them all, so they only get part of the story, and it's not as interesting. But now I have access to 10-minute videos, so I'm gonna make this video a little bit longer, but hopefully not 10 minutes. So like I said at the top of the video, I'm in the minority when I say that Dark Souls 2 is the best in the series, except for maybe Elden Ring, and I only say maybe because I haven't beaten it yet, so I can't say it with full confidence. I'm not gonna spend the whole video trying to convince you as to why Dark Souls 2 is the best in the series. I know that the main reason that I like it is because it was my first Souls-like experience, and I spent most of it playing it with my brother, and I always love playing co-op with my brother. But what I do want to talk about is the development process of this game and how it went through hell, and is one of the main reasons why this game is so divisive and feels off to a lot of players. It's no secret that Demon's Souls was the first in the series, and then because of copyright issues, FromSoft went and made Dark Souls, and it was really successful as well, so they knew that they had to make a sequel, or a threequel. The following game. But even before the game started its development, there was already grumbling from the community that was concerned because Hideki Miyazaki wasn't going to be directing the game anymore. Instead, he was going to take a more passive role as a supervisor. Now, from everything that I read, this is where things start to get muddy because there are some people that think that there were two directors working on the game at the same time, but there's also a group that thinks that there was one director and then halfway through production, they ended up passing off the director role to somebody else. I think it's probably more like the second story versus the first story. Tomohiro Shibuya was the director that was chosen for Dark Souls 2, and he immediately began work on the game, but as he was moving forward, he decided that a lot of the ideas that he had wouldn't work on the engine that they were using, so instead he wanted to develop the game while also developing a brand new engine so that everything he wanted would be possible. Lots of companies have done this, don't get me wrong, but what happens if you don't plan this from the start is it overcomplicates things and they both encumber each other. Take this for example. If the developers come up with an idea of something that they want to do in the game, the engine now has to have a way to have it happen. But if the engine runs into a quirk that makes things complicated, the developers now have to go and rewrite what they were originally planning. So in turn, they both slow each other down, making things far more complicated and a lot slower. So development moved forward, and one of the things that devs wanted to implement into Dark Souls 2 was having an open world. The thing with open world is that it's very complicated and it can be very taxing on hardware. They were developing for the PS3 and the 360, which were both decent machines, but they were kind of complicated to develop for, and they weren't powerful enough to really do a good open world system. Keep in mind that they were trying to have cutting edge graphics as well, and you know that the mechanics have to be perfect. So once you put all of it together, it was just a bit too much for that generation of games. This is where development started to slow down because they were finding in order to add these new elements, they had to start changing things in Dark Souls, and they started to lose the things that made the first game so wonderful. The higher-ups weren't too happy about this, so they decided to step in and change who was going to be the director. So Yui Tanimura is the man chosen for the job. He has to walk into this disaster zone and get things back on track, and he has a really hard decision to make, which is either trash everything and start from scratch, or take the mess he's got and try to rework it in a way that at least still feels like Dark Souls. And he decides that he's gonna try to rework what he's got because the looming deadline just won't give him enough time to make a game that's worthwhile. And this is how we end up with a Dark Souls 2 that feels so different than the other Dark Souls out there. Because Yui Tanimura had to take a game that was now very different from Dark Souls and try to rein it back into being similar to Dark Souls. He took NPCs that had one job and gave them a totally different job and a different place in the story, using some, ditching others, and in turn having to change the locations that they were in and how the location looked in general. This also meant that he had to rewrite the lore so it all made sense. And obviously if they used assets that were directed in a different way, it's still not going to mesh perfectly in the Dark Souls world, which is why it doesn't feel like Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 felt like a flowing world with interconnected tunnels and shortcuts, and it made every place feel like it was genuinely connected to the other places. Whereas Dark Souls 2 is more like a central hub that leads you through a tunnel to a brand new place, but none of them have anything to do with the other, and there is no connection. It just feels disjointed. Honestly, I can accept a disjointed game. I mean, look at Demon's Souls. It was literally a hub with portals to random lands that had nothing to do with each other. So Dark Souls 2 doing this wasn't a big deal. What players really had a hard time with was the way that the game ran, because the final release did not run well. But believe it or not, the original release that Tanimura got his hands on ran far worse. If you compare the promotional material to the way that the game was released, there was a significant downgrade. The lighting was better, the graphics were better, but the game did not run well. It ran horrendously. So Tanimura had a really big decision to make, and that was how was he going to get the game at a respectable frame rate. So he did the only thing he could. He locked it at 30 frames a second and reduced the graphics. And you know what happened with Watch Dogs. People were very upset. gamers actually accused the company of having done false advertising in order to sell this game and then sold us something that was nowhere near as good. Little did they know that the gameplay was so bad that they had to do this. And despite all this, the game still did okay. It did well enough for DLC to be approved. And these developers got to work on it from start to finish, which meant they didn't have to clean somebody else's mess and get something that was so far off track back on track and meet a deadline, and instead make something that was their own idea, working it from the start to the finish, and have it be more cohesive, run better, look better, and just be more fun overall. And with the success of that, they were able to go and remake Dark Souls 2. Instead of just relaunching it on Xbox One and PS4, they reworked it and released Scholar of the Last Sin, which was a full revamp of the original Dark Souls 2, with slightly better graphics, better performance, and reworking of where the NPCs were and how things worked out in the game. One, making people who had played the original want to play this one because of the changes, and two, allowing people to see how much better the game could be with a bit more time for them to work on it. And I personally think it's the better of the two. I know this video isn't going to convince you that Dark Souls 2 is the best in the series. In fact, it's probably good proof as to why it's the worst in the series. But despite all of that, there is a group of us that think that this game should be held in high regard. Because if you consider the fact that it went through development hell, had to change directors and change direction halfway through, and work with somebody else's mess, I think it did pretty well. And then when you include the DLC and the relaunch of the game, it's a pretty impressive feat that they accomplished. I'm okay with being in the minority, and I still think this game is one of the best in the series, because I just like the way that the world looks, the different locations that you visit, the dual wielding, and overall I enjoy the graphics. I may be in a minority here, but I still think it's the best. Although, I may have to change my mind once I finish Elden Ring. We'll see what happens, but it'll still be really high up there for me. Thank you for making it to the end of the video, and if you did, let me know in the comments if you like this kind of stuff, because I like to dig deep, I like having all this random information, and I have lots of videos that I parted out into 4 or 5 parts that I could make one long video of if you're interested in this. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you didn't, thank you for sticking around anyways, and I will see you on my next video. Alright, see you later.